Ethan had seen his fair share of absurd rules in the years he'd lived in the Willow Creek neighborhood. From the exact shade of beige required for mailboxes to the specific types of flowers allowed in front yards, the Homeowners Association, HOA, had a knack for micromanaging every aspect of life. But when he pulled the letter from his mailbox that sunny Tuesday afternoon, he knew this was a new level of ridiculousness. The letter, printed on official HOA letterhead, was titled Unauthorized Pool Removal Notice. Ethan had to read it twice to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. According to the notice, his above-ground pool was a non-compliant structure that violated community guidelines. It demanded that he remove the pool within 48 hours or face legal action, with the HOA threatening to remove it at his expense. Ethan laughed out loud. His pool was a standard model, nothing extravagant or illegal. He had installed it well within his property lines, followed all city regulations, and even gone the extra mile to ensure it had the proper safety barriers. As a certified pool safety inspector by profession, Ethan knew better than anyone whether his pool met compliance standards. But apparently, the HOA had other ideas. He scanned the letter again, looking for specifics on what rule he had supposedly broken. Instead, he found only a vague claim that the pool was aesthetic pollution. That wasn't a rule, it was just someone's personal opinion. Ethan sighed. He had a feeling he knew exactly who was behind this nonsense. The Willow Creek HOA was run by Margaret, a woman whose reputation for enforcing arbitrary rules was legendary. If someone parked their car an inch over the line, Margaret would be there with a measuring tape. If a mailbox was the wrong shade of beige, she'd send out a citation. And now, it seemed, she had decided that Ethan's pool was her next target. Ethan wasn't going to let this slide. He decided to confront the issue head-on at the next HOA meeting. The meetings were typically dull, filled with discussions about landscaping budgets and parking violations. But this time, as Ethan stepped into the community clubhouse, he could feel the tension in the air. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her sharp gaze scanning the small crowd of homeowners, as if daring anyone to challenge her authority. Ethan raised his hand. "I'd like to discuss the removal notice I received about my pool," he said, his voice calm but firm. Margaret's lips tightened into a thin line. "There's nothing to discuss. The notice is valid, and you need to comply." "I'd like to know why it's valid," Ethan shot back. "I've checked the city ordinances, and my pool is fully compliant. So what exactly am I violating?" Margaret huffed. "The HOA has aesthetic standards. Your pool disrupts the uniformity of the neighborhood." "That's not a rule," Ethan said, folding his arms. "That's just your opinion." A few of the other homeowners shifted uncomfortably. Ethan wasn't the only one who had been subjected to Margaret's overreach, but most people preferred to stay quiet rather than risk getting on her bad side. Margaret, sensing the wavering support, straightened her posture and spoke in her most authoritative tone. "The HOA has the right to enforce community standards. This isn't just about you, Ethan. It's about maintaining property values." That made Ethan laugh. "Right, because my perfectly legal pool is somehow bringing down the neighborhood. What about Mr. Thompson's rusted-out shed that's been sitting untouched for 3 years? Or the fact that half the lawns on Maple Drive are dead? If we're talking about property values, maybe we should start there." A murmur ran through the room. Margaret's grip on power relied on people being too intimidated to push back. But now, Ethan had cracked the door open, and people were starting to peek inside. Margaret's face flushed. "This isn't up for debate. You have 48 hours to remove that pool, or we will take action." Ethan clenched his jaw. He could argue all night, but Margaret wasn't going to budge. The only thing left to do was prepare for whatever ridiculous stunt she planned next. Ethan spent the next day double-checking his legal standing. If Margaret thought she could bully him into compliance, she was in for a surprise. Not only was his pool completely legal, but he had already consulted a city inspector months ago when he installed it. If the HOA wanted a fight, he was ready. Still, something about Margaret's smug confidence at the meeting bothered him. She had a reputation for going to extreme lengths to enforce her will, and Ethan doubted she'd just wait for the 48-hour deadline to pass before making her move. At exactly 7 p.m., his phone buzzed. It was a text from his neighbor, Jake. "Dude, just saw Margaret talking to some cops in front of your house. Thought you should know." Ethan stared at the screen. She wouldn't, would she? The next morning, Ethan jolted awake to the sound of aggressive knocking at his front door. The sun was barely up, and for a brief, groggy moment, he thought he had imagined it. Then it came again, bam, 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 loud and forceful, not the knock of a neighbor borrowing sugar. He groaned, dragging himself out of bed and rubbing his eyes as he checked the time, 7:02 a.m. Who in their right mind? Another round of pounding rattled the door frame. Yeah, I'm coming, he called, throwing on a t-shirt and heading for the front door. He swung it open, blinking against the early morning light. 2 uniformed police officers stood on his doorstep. Ethan blinked again, now fully awake. "Good morning, sir," one of the officers said, his tone professional but with a flicker of awkwardness, like he wasn't thrilled to be here. "We received a complaint from your homeowners association regarding an unauthorized, hazardous structure on your property." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me." Behind the officers, standing off to the side with her arms crossed like she was personally overseeing an FBI raid, was Margaret. She gave him a tight-lipped smirk. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, trying to keep his voice even. "You're talking about my pool?" The second officer glanced down at his notepad. "That appears to be the case, sir. You realize it's a standard, legal, fully compliant above-ground pool, right?" The officers exchanged a look. The first one cleared his throat. "We don't enforce HOA policies, but since they made a complaint about a potential safety violation, we're required to check." Ethan sighed and stepped aside. "Be my guest." The officers followed him into the backyard, where the infamous, hazardous structure sat in perfect, sparkling condition. The pool was pristine, the secure fencing was intact, and the ladder was locked. Not a single thing was out of order. The officers scanned the area. One of them let out a quiet snort, as if trying not to laugh. "Yeah, this looks pretty standard," the first officer admitted. Ethan turned toward Margaret, who had marched into the yard after them, looking impatient. "What exactly do you think is illegal about this?" Margaret stiffened. "The HOA has rules, and his pool violates them." One of the officers scratched his head. "Ma'am, we're not here to enforce HOA rules. We're here to check for safety hazards." "I'm a certified pool safety inspector," Ethan added casually. "I inspect pools for a living." Silence. The second officer looked at him, eyebrows raised. "Wait, you're a what?" Ethan pulled out his work ID and handed it over. "Certified through the state. I inspect pools for compliance. I could literally write a report on my own pool confirming it meets every standard." One of the officers let out a low whistle. That's ironic." The other officer chuckled, shaking his head. "First time I've ever been called to investigate a pool owned by the guy who inspects pools." Margaret's face turned red. "That doesn't matter. The HOA has regulations, and we can enforce them as we see fit." The first officer turned to her, suddenly all business. "Ma'am, HOA rules don't override city ordinances. You don't have the authority to remove someone's property without a legal basis." Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again like a fish gasping for air. "So, is there an actual violation?" Ethan asked, tilting his head. The officers exchanged a glance. "Nope," the first one said. Ethan turned to Margaret, grinning. "Well, there you go. The professionals have spoken." Margaret's face twisted in frustration. She was cornered, and she knew it. "This isn't over," she snapped before spinning on her heel and storming away. The officers stayed for a few minutes longer, mostly out of curiosity. "So, seriously," one of them said, shaking his head, "how bad is this HOA?" Ethan chuckled. "Let's just say if I trim my hedges an inch too high, I'll probably find a violation notice in my mailbox before I even put the clippers away." The officer whistled. "Yikes. Well, if they call again, we'll know what we're dealing with." They left, still shaking their heads, and Ethan exhaled in relief. Crisis averted, for now. Because if he knew Margaret, and unfortunately he did, this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Ethan wasn't the kind of guy who looked for trouble, but at this point, trouble had practically sent him an engraved invitation. After the whole fiasco with the police, he knew Margaret wouldn't just let things go. She had been humiliated, and someone like her didn't take embarrassment lightly. She would come back swinging, probably with some new HOA technicality she had pulled out of thin air. That's when Ethan decided to fight fire with fire. Instead of just waiting for Margaret's next attack, he grabbed a notepad, a cup of coffee, and spent an afternoon reading through the HOA's entire rulebook. It was 127 pages of bureaucratic nonsense, but buried in all the legal jargon, he found something interesting. Margaret herself was breaking multiple HOA rules. Her fence was 6 inches taller than regulations allowed. Her shed had been built without the required HOA approval. And her fire pit? That thing was completely against community fire safety standards. The next HOA meeting was more crowded than usual. Word had spread about Margaret calling the cops over Ethan's perfectly legal pool, and neighbors were starting to get fed up. People weren't just there to talk about property lines and landscaping complaints anymore. They were here for a showdown. Margaret, as always, sat at the head of the table, looking smug and self-important. She called the meeting to order, rambling through some standard agenda items before Ethan raised his hand. "I'd like to bring up a few violations that need to be addressed," he said, standing up. Margaret smirked. "If this is about your pool again, we're not discussing it." "Oh, it's not about my pool," Ethan interrupted. "It's about a few other properties that aren't compliant with HOA rules." Margaret's expression faltered slightly. Ethan pulled out his notepad. "Let's start with fencing regulations. HOA guidelines state that fences can be no higher than 6 feet. Yet somehow, Margaret's fence is 6 feet, 6 inches, a clear violation." A few people in the room murmured. Margaret sat up straighter. "That's ridiculous. It was approved years ago." Ethan flipped a page. "Actually, it wasn't. The HOA's records don't show an approval request for your fence. You never applied for an exemption." Margaret's lips thinned. Ethan continued. "Now, on to shed regulations. HOA rules require board approval before installing any outbuildings. I checked the records, and there's no approval for your shed, either. In fact, I don't think it was even mentioned in any prior meetings." More murmuring. Someone in the back laughed quietly. Margaret's face turned an impressive shade of red. "This is absurd. My shed isn't hurting anyone." "Neither was my pool," Ethan said, tilting his head. "Yet you were ready to send the cops over it." That got some nods of agreement from the room. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked around as if expecting someone to jump to her defense, but for once, no one did. Ethan pulled out the final piece of evidence. "And lastly, open flame regulations. HOA policy clearly prohibits open fire pits within 15 feet of any structure. Yet Margaret's fire pit is," he pulled out a photo and placed it on the table, 7 feet from her back porch. A man in the crowd chuckled. "Wow, Margaret, that's not very compliant of you." Margaret's entire body went rigid. Ethan leaned forward. "Now, since we're all about enforcing the rules fairly, I assume you'll be addressing these violations immediately, right?" Margaret's jaw was so tight, he thought she might crack a tooth. She didn't respond. That's when another board member, an older man named Ted, cleared his throat. "You know," he said slowly, "this isn't the first time complaints about Margaret's selective enforcement have come up." Ethan turned, curious. Ted glanced around the room before pulling out a folder. "I've actually been keeping records of HOA violations for the past couple of years. And funny thing, I found a pattern. Margaret's always real quick to issue fines and citations to other homeowners. But when it comes to her own property, somehow she always gets an exception." The crowd stirred. Margaret looked like she wanted to disappear through the floor. Ted placed the folder on the table. "I think it's time we have a serious discussion about HOA leadership." Someone clapped. Then another person. Then another. Margaret stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. This is a witch hunt. I have done nothing but uphold the standards of this community." "That's funny," Ethan said, crossing his arms, "because it kind of seems like you've been making them up as you go." A woman near the front stood. "I second the motion for a leadership vote." Margaret froze. The room exploded into agreement. Ted nodded. "All in favor." Hands shot up across the room. Margaret's eyes darted around, realizing she was losing control. "You can't do this. You don't understand how much work goes into running this HOA." "Then maybe it's time someone else does the job," Ted said. The vote was cast. Margaret was officially removed as HOA president. She sat there, stunned, as people applauded. Ethan leaned back in his chair, smiling. His pool was still standing. Margaret's reign of HOA terror? Not so much. Ethan didn't have to wait long to find out Margaret's next move. Less than a week after her humiliating removal from HOA leadership, He received a phone call from his friend at the city inspector's office, Carlos. Carlos was chuckling even before Ethan could say hello. "You're never going to believe this one, Ethan." "What now?" Ethan asked, bracing himself. "Margaret filed another complaint about your pool. Claimed it's dangerous and uninspected." Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "Again? Does she ever quit?" "Nope," Carlos replied, sounding thoroughly amused. "And guess who got assigned to inspect your so-called hazardous structure?" Ethan grinned knowingly. "Let me guess you?" "Bingo," Carlos laughed. "I told my supervisor it was a waste of time. But hey, paperwork is paperwork." They agreed Carlos would swing by later that afternoon, mostly for the sake of procedure. Ethan wasn't worried, but he was curious to see how Margaret would react once she discovered the tables had turned yet again. At precisely 2:30 p.m., Carlos arrived with his clipboard and camera. The entire inspection lasted about 2 minutes, after which he dramatically checked off every box on his form, officially certifying Ethan's pool as completely safe and compliant. "Now, let's talk about something more interesting," Carlos said, pulling a folder out of his bag. "I decided to swing by Margaret's place earlier, just out of curiosity." Ethan raised an eyebrow. Carlos smiled wickedly. It wasn't pretty. He handed Ethan a stack of photographs and copies of violation reports detailing Margaret's backyard in all its glory: an oversized fence, the infamous fire pit, and, surprise, surprise, a dilapidated garden shed that clearly violated multiple city ordinances. "You find her?" Ethan asked, barely containing his amusement. "Oh, yes," Carlos said dramatically. "And trust me, the look on her face when I handed her the citations was priceless." Ethan laughed so hard his sides hurt. He knew Margaret wouldn't take this lying down, but at least the city was firmly on his side. The revenge tasted sweet indeed. As summer reached its peak, Ethan decided the best way to celebrate his victory and the neighborhood's newfound freedom was with an epic pool party. After all the unnecessary drama he'd endured, it was time to reclaim some joy. Word spread quickly, and within days, the neighborhood buzzed with excitement over Ethan's planned event. On the chosen Saturday afternoon, the weather was perfect: warm sun, gentle breeze, clear skies. Ethan's yard filled quickly with neighbors, some of whom he'd barely spoken to before. Kids splashed and shouted happily in the pool, adults mingled over barbecue and drinks, and music drifted lazily through the air. The highlight, though, was seeing the HOA board members casually chatting with everyone, genuinely relaxed for the first time in memory. Ted raised a toast to Ethan halfway through the party, thanking him openly for his bravery and standing up to Margaret's tyranny. Ethan was embarrassed, but also proud. What had started as an absurd battle had turned into a neighborhood revival. Through the laughter and chatter, Ethan caught a glimpse of Margaret watching sourly from her living room window. Her expression darkened as he raised his glass to her in mock salute. He couldn't help but chuckle. It was petty, sure, but it felt fantastic. As the evening wore on, the conversations grew livelier. One neighbor joked loudly, "Hey, Ethan, you should run for HOA president." "I second that," someone shouted, followed by cheers and laughter. Ethan waved off the idea, grinning sheepishly, but felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't anticipated. He hadn't just saved his pool, he'd rescued the neighborhood from Margaret's tyranny. Just as the sun began to set, the HOA's new president, Diane, stepped forward, clinking her glass to get everyone's attention. "We owe Ethan our gratitude for taking a stand and bringing some sanity back to our community," she declared warmly. The neighbors cheered and applauded enthusiastically. Ethan felt warmth in his chest, not from embarrassment, but genuine pride. He had fought a ridiculous battle and won, and it felt good to know he made a difference. Weeks passed, and life in the neighborhood improved dramatically. People no longer lived in fear of citations for trivial infractions, and neighbors began to socialize more frequently. Even the lawn seemed greener and livelier, now free from Margaret's oppressive gaze. Then came one afternoon, as Ethan was watering his garden, when he noticed a moving truck pulling up in front of Margaret's house. Surprised, he watched as movers quickly began loading boxes. Margaret stood out front, overseeing the process with her trademark scowl. "Moving on already?" Ethan called cheerfully across the lawn. Margaret shot him a cold glare, folding her arms defensively. "Congratulations, Ethan. You got your way." I hope you enjoy living in a neighborhood without standards." Ethan smiled pleasantly. "Oh, I think we'll manage." She scoffed, turned sharply on her heels, and stormed back inside. Within hours, the truck was loaded, and Margaret's car pulled away, leaving a strangely peaceful silence behind. A few weeks later, Ethan saw another moving truck, this time unloading in front of Margaret's old place. Curious, he wandered over to greet the new neighbor, a friendly-looking younger man named Steve. After exchanging introductions, Ethan asked what brought him to the area. "Oh, I'm starting a new business," the man said cheerfully. "I install swimming pools." Figured this was a perfect neighborhood. Seems like people here appreciate a good backyard pool. Ethan laughed out loud, shaking the man's hand enthusiastically. "Friend, you have no idea how right you are." From that day forward, pools sprouted up in yards all across the neighborhood, transforming the community into a haven of summer fun. The HOA meetings became less about petty grievances and more about community cookouts and block parties. Ethan's pool, once labeled an eyesore, was now the neighborhood icon, a symbol of unity, freedom, and triumph against petty tyranny. And every time he lounged beside that once contentious pool, sipping lemonade and soaking in the afternoon sun, Ethan couldn't help but smile. Because sometimes, the best revenge really was just living well and swimming freely. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.